September 2020, we embarked on a journey of discovery, taking the same multitrack to 8 of the world's top producers. And we had some really interesting thoughts about what those results would be. And we had this question about, well, would all the mixes sound like they've got a bit of a cookie cutter approach, that they'd sound very similar? As you're going to hear in this screencast, nothing could be further from the truth. The results are significantly different in almost all respects. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this video. Comparing and contrasting the different qualities of these mixes, but not in a way that it's a shootout, because let's face it, these are 8 of the world's top producers that are Grammy Award winning, highly revered producers that have got their own production techniques to work for them, that gives them their productions with their own sonic identity. And I think what's important is what production approaches and techniques and gestures work for one producer won't work for other producers, and won't work for you if you are indeed a mix engineer. Compare these differences and relate them to the mix methodology of what this is a result of. So it's really fascinating. Along the way, what we've got, as you'll see on screen here, we've got them in chronological order. So the first mix that was actually carried out was by the research team. And the reason we did this is that some of the producers wanted a reference mix. They wanted to say, well, thanks for the multi-track, but can I have a reference mix to give me a general context for the production? So we did that. And then from there, the first mixer was Andrew Sheps. And then we went to Fredrik Nordstrom, Jens Bogren, Mike Exeter, Josh Middleton, Adam Nolly Getgood, David Tiro, and Buster Oderholm. And you'll see in the edit window here, you'll see that each of the names are in chronological order, and so you'll be able to see when I'm switching from one mix to the other. What we're going to do firstly is just have a broad listen to the overall mix qualities, and I'll just flick through. And I think the main element that this really highlights is the difference in perceptual heaviness. So what we're going to do, play through all of the mixes, and I'll just flick from one to the other, and you're going to hear the differences in heaviness and the difference in the production values. I'll firstly go through in chronological order, starting in the research mix, going through to Buster Oderholm's mix. Andrew Sheps. Fredrik Nordstrom. Jens Bogren. Mike Exeter. Josh Middleton. Adam Nolly Getgood. David Tiro. Buster Oderholm. Back to the research team mix. Firstly, I'm hoping you'll be able to clearly hear the differences in nearly all respects. What we're going to firstly look at, let's look at the sense of, just the sense of size and dimension, and how there's different qualities within these productions. And let's be a bit more specific. The depth dimension firstly. In other words, the amount of reverbs, how proximate the sounds are, how bright they are, how close they seem to us, and at the same time the depth perspective, how much reverb is in there. Have a listen. From the solitude of Trojan's hearts, race Jericho's falling. Fredrik Nordstrom. What I'll just do here is look at the comparisons, and we can take a particularly bright mix, one that's very, very aggressive, really in your face. For example, Buster Oderholm. From the solitude of Trojan's hearts, then to Andrew Sheps. You can hear the significant brightness differences there. how in your face it is, and this is sometimes referred to as hyperreality. And hyperreality is that things are bigger. It's almost like it's like Sonic cartoons, and in this respect, it's you know, cartoons make things larger than life, and you know, going to Disney World where everything's larger than life. And with music production, that is one approach, is that everything is almost impossibly close to you and impossibly big in a larger than life way. And some people feel that it sounds unnatural, that it sounds fake, and much, you know, other people prefer a much more organic, natural sound to the production. And you can hear the differences there between Buster Oderholm and Andrew Sheps. One more time. Let's go from Andrew Sheps to Buster Oderholm. A few other significant differences. Mike Exeter. You just hear the significant differences in brightness. Let's also now look at reverb. Let's look at a few other elements. Let's go from Andrew Sheps, and we'll go from Andrew Sheps to Frederick Nordstrom. You can hear the clear differences in the amount of, the extent of reverb and the different reverbs that are used there. Obviously there's similar differences if you listen to Josh Middleton, to David Tiro, Adam Nolly Get-Good, Jens Bargren, to Mike Exeter. And if you want to highlight these differences in the depth dimension even more, then listen on headphones, and you'll really hear these reverb tails a lot closer on headphones. That'll really highlight those differences. Let's move on to low end qualities. We've looked at proximity and we've looked at the depth dimension, and let's look at sonic weight, the low end. And this is again something that you'll hear some really clear differences. We'll start with Adam Nolly Get-Good. A lot of you will know about Nolly. He's a bass player, and the extent of attention in the multi-track to the bass sound and the bass tone on Adam's was very significant in the amount of attention that he gave to the bass. Let's have a listen to Adam Nolly Get-Good, and then we'll jump directly to the research team mix. And you should be able to see on screen, hopefully you'll be able to see in these areas here, which mix we're jumping to, and just listen to the differences in the low end. So mainly the kick and the bass, but also the low end of the guitars. Let's have a listen. Mike Exeter, Jens Bargren, Buster Oderholm, David Tiro, research team mix. Frederick Nordstrom, Andrew Sheps. What you'll hear is a difference in how forceful the low end is and how present in the mix it is. What you'll probably notice, and this is quite interesting, is that the level of the kick drum on Mike Exeter and Andrew Sheps is definitely further back. It's almost more of a rock mix than a metal mix. And if you listen to, for example, the difference between Andrew Sheps's kick drum, let's have a listen on the intro verse section here. So that's Andrew Sheps's, and then listen to the kick level on Buster, comparing it to Buster Oderholm or indeed David Tiro's. So starting with Andrew Sheps, then to Buster, then to David Tiro. David Tiro. This comes back to the subject that I was discussing earlier, this subject of hyperreality. And very importantly here is the clickiness, the brightness of the kick drum. And you could argue that that makes it less organic and less natural than a kick drum that sounds like a natural kick drum. When you hear a kick drum in a room, even with click pads, even with plastic beaters and they won't be as clicky as this. So they're almost larger than life in their brightness and the way that they jump out of the mix. But from your perspective as the listener, does it make it an improved listening experience? Does the kick drum, sort of like really kicking your teeth in, improve the experience, or is a more natural kick level and a more natural sound something that you more naturally gravitate towards? Moving onwards, let's consider the guitars and the width of the mix. And often, particularly with a metal mix, the width of the soundscape is determined by the width of the guitars. Mike Exeter, in his contributions to this, you know, I said, are the guitars fully wide? And he was like, is there any other way of mixing guitars? Whereas other producers have taken a different approach here. What's worthy of mention here is that the producers had the option of multiple different guitar sounds, but of 4 performances. Some producers only opted to use 2 guitars. Some use what's called quad tracking, and there's variations not only in the stereo width, but variations in the stereo width according to what guitars they chose. To be more specific, the greater the differences between left and right in a mix, the greater the perceived width. And some bands will have the same sound, like if you listen to, I don't know, at the Gates at War with Reality, you'll hear the same rhythm guitar sound in the left and the right. It sounds amazing. But then other bands will deliberately, and other producers will deliberately vary the sounds between left and right. And that gives a greater sense of width to the production, arguably. It depends on what you want to go for here. So we'll listen to not only the sense of width, which again will be extenuated and made more obvious through headphones, but also the brightness of the guitars, tying into that sense of proximity that we spoke about earlier. So let's go the other way this time. We'll go to a very bright mix. We'll go to Buster Oderholm, and then we'll go to Dave Otero, sort of like reverse chronological order. And what we're listening for is the brightness of the guitars and the way that impacts the width. How wide does it sound? The sense of dimension, how wide that sense of dimension is. Here we go. David Otero. Adam Molly-Gutdug. Josh Middleton. Mike Exeter. Jens Bogren. Fredrik Nordstrom. Andrew Sheps. And the research team mix. So although we've been listening to the guitars within the context of the mix, because obviously that's mainly the context within which we normally hear the guitars, there is a section within the song, comes in around 2.5 minutes just after that, where there's a solo guitar riff which allows you to more easily analyse the different tones of the guitars, brightness levels, how they're panned, etc. And we can quickly listen to this section here. We'll start with Jens Bogren. Andrew Sheps. Research team mix. You can hear the different panning approach that I've gone for there, and I've really gone towards one speaker rather than the impact of both speakers having the guitars, and you can hear it's more heavily panned over to the left. Mike Exeter. Josh Middleton. Molly. David Otero. Buster Oderholm. Yeah, those differences quite easily there, but obviously in most instances we listen to the guitar within the context of the mix. What this section does though also is it gives us opportunity to hear slower subdivisions, and the greater distance between the notes gives more space and greater opportunities for each of the producers to really capitalize on that, whereby there's more space between the notes for the decay qualities of your reverb, so you can get greater reverb without it potentially muddying up the mix, and you can get more low frequencies. There's more space for those low frequencies to expire before the next performance event, and when there isn't, it just ends up being a little bit mushy. You know, as an extreme example, imagine a blast beat with a Def Leppard snare drum. It just becomes a mush of sound. The faster the performance, the tighter the sounds need to be to retain clarity. Well, in this section, there's greater space, more space for reverb, more space for low frequency content. So we're going to move on to making some comparisons with the ways that these different producers have presented the drums. And there's a critical consideration with drums here that I just want to introduce before we start having a listen to the results of these mixes, and that is the subject of cohesion. And it's a subject that's really interesting. It's how, in broad terms, how naturally these given elements sound like they are taking place within the same environment, or how different they sound. In other words, to take one example, it sounds like a natural drum kit heard of a drummer in the room with you listening to the drummer, or more towards the separate components of a drum machine. It's a critical consideration to how natural, organic it sounds, but also some people choose not to do that, and it's just about maximum sonic impact and how overproduced it might sound. And I loved that in the interviews for this project, I asked Buster Oderholm if there's anything, if metal music can be overproduced, and he said, yeah, every one of my productions is overproduced. Everything, every tiny little element like the hi-hat or each tom is optimized to give it maximum sonic impact. And so when you listen to this, it's not just how each drum component sounds on their own, it's how the drum kit sounds as a whole, and the significance there, significant differences. So let me give you an example. Let's start with Jens Bogren. And Jens has got a real sense of cohesion between the kick and snare, because he's very closely matched up the levels of brightness within each. Just have a listen to Jens's mix and just have a listen to that. So we're listening to kick and snare. So they've both got very equivalent punch and brightness, and that makes them have a certain sort of like quality of cohesion, whereas for example, Mike Exeter goes with a different approach with his kick and snare that works in a different way, and whether you feel it's more natural or whether you feel it's heavier or less heavier, that's completely up to you as the listener. So this is a bit of Mike Exeter's. Likewise, if we then go to, real hyper-reality with Buster Oderholm's. And then perhaps the element of Dave Attiro's mix, that one of the components, one of the qualities that is very, very different, that makes Dave Attiro's very different from the others, is the air frequencies in Dave Attiro's mix. There's this very controlled but very, very significant sense of the air frequencies, sort of like 10k upwards, particularly around 12, 13k. Just have a listen to Dave Attiro's mix and listen to those upper frequencies. And compare it to, say, Mike Exeter. Significant differences. Andrew Sheps. You can hear the differences in those high frequencies. Also the sense of reverb. Let's just listen to the different reverb in the mix from, say, Frederick Nordstrom's. Now let's jump to Adam Nolly Getgood's. Here, have a listen. That's Frederick's. This is Nolly's. But what you'll hear in each instance is you can't assess these qualities in isolation. You hear it as informed by every other bit of the mix. So the guitars will impact how you hear the cymbals, which will impact how you hear the kick and the snare. And it's fascinating, it really is. Let's just look at a couple of other elements of the drums. So let's just compare the toms in this given section. And again, a way to get more cohesion between your drums is for your toms to have the same sort of spectral footprint, if you will, as the kick drum. If your kick's very dark and punchy in the lows, then your toms would have the same. Or if your kick's very clicky and bright, then your toms should have the same qualities. Obviously, the snare's different. It's the only component of the kit with the snare wires, but really your kick and your toms from a shell perspective, you'd get more cohesion by having similar levels of brightness. But just listen to the impact. We'll just go couple of seconds before this tom section and listen to the different ways that the producers have presented the toms. Starting with Andrew, let's start with the research team mix. Here we go. Andrew Sheps. Can listen to the sense of width with the drums as well. What's interesting is Mike Exeter changes his panning with his toms with almost every fill, depending on how many toms there are in the fill. He optimized the stereo width for that, which is really interesting. So let's have a listen to Mike Exeter's there. Significant difference from Andrew Sheps. You can hear the sonic impact of Andrew's floor tom. Let's have a listen again. Same with Frederick Nordstrom's. Jens Bogren. Josh Middleton. Adam Nolly Get Good. What you'll also hear here, which is fascinating, is the different producers have taken a different option with the panning of the toms. So most of the producers have panned what's called audience perspective, as if you're looking at the drummer. So in this instance, the toms with a regular right-handed drummer will go from right to left. As you're looking at the drummer would go around the toms and they would go right to left. And this is similar how we get the toms usually panned live, again with a regular right-handed drummer. Adam Nolly Get Good prefers what's referred to as drummer perspective panning, and what you'll hear here is that it's as if the drummer is behind the kit, and so the floor tom and the third tom here is from the right of the mix. Let's have a listen to Nolly's mix again. This side. Quick listen to David Tiro. I think David Tiro's gone a drummer perspective as well. Let's listen to Buster Oderholm. So you can hear the different panning, you can hear the different levels of brightness and the differences between the, the kick and the toms with all of these. So pretty much the other aspect with all of these is to consider is the amount of reverb on the drums, and the amount of reverb can add to this sense of cohesion. But if you get a chance, if you do access all of these files, go through with headphones on and listen to the way that the producers have introduced reverb into the drums and how that makes it sort of get pushed away from the listener. That puts up this subtle barrier between the listener and the sound, which reverb does, or whether it's a bit more up front and a bit more drier and a little bit more in your face. It's really, really interesting. But let's move on to bass. We've listened to a really good mix. The first quality of a great mix is clarity, and particularly with metal music, as Colin Richardson says, you're always looking for clarity. And we've just listened to the toms. Let's now listen to the bass on the same section. And you'll hear on Frederick Nordstrom's mix, particularly from the lows, you'll hear the bass quite clear on the bottom end. Let's have a listen. You can hear that sustain on the first note where it goes into the tom section. Have another listen. Compared to Andrew Sheps. And the bass is similarly present in Andrew's mix, but in a different place in the spectrum, which just gives it a different impact. Let's jump to Adam's. Adam's spent a significant time on his bass sound here with 5 different signals that were bringing different qualities to the mix. But listen to Adam's on the same section. You can listen to the way that the drive qualities of the bass have helped it gel with the guitars and gives it a greater sense of cohesion. Let's do the same with David Tiro firstly, then Buster Oderholm. Buster Oderholm. Josh Middleton. Mike Exeter. Jens Bogren. And the research team mix. Here we go. So all of those differences, you can hear different senses of drive and distortion within the low end of the bass. What's fascinating is that Buster distorts the low frequencies of the bass, something that I was fascinated to see because that's not something I do, is I like to keep the low end clean. I kind of tend to find muddy frequencies in the lows and abrasive frequencies in the highs, but Buster's bass sound is absolutely phenomenal on this. So it's very, very interesting how each of the producers presents it differently. And again, if you get a chance to listen through, listen to the note definition, how the note pops out on various sections of the mix. Like there's different bass runs that you'll find. So that little section there, you can hear that little bass run from Luke. This is Luke Appleton, the bassist on this production. Listen to the little bass run there. And then just listen to how different the sense of note definition is there on the different mixes. So research team mix. Andrew Sheps. Fredrik Nordstrom, Jens Bogren, Mike Exeter, Josh Middleton, Adam Nolly Getgood, David Tiro, Buster Oderholm, and the research team mix. Of course, this is not just the bass sound, it's potentially automation and just lifting areas of interest within the mix. So let's move on to the guitars. We've already considered the guitars from a brightness and a proximity perspective. Let's just quickly listen to the sense of low end weight and the level within the mix, how they're balanced, and the impact on the rest of the mix is really significant. It impacts the vocal as well, and if you get a chance to come back and listen to the vocal or listen to the vocal when we're playing these different sections, I'll play a different portion of the mix here and we'll listen to this section here, to the chorus, and listen to the way that the guitars are presenting the lows and the mids and the highs, but also listen to the way that it impacts the vocal and whether the vocal is sort of foregrounded from the guitars or blended into the guitars. And again, just the emphasis on lows, mids or highs with the guitars, and again how distorted the guitars are. Some of the producers here, for example Josh and Buster, have decided to use amp modeling without reamping them. They've actually used plugins in the mix, which means that they can change the drive, the distortion characteristics within the mix. And again, the level of distortion really impacts everything else in the mix, that how dense that sonic wall of sound is. So let's listen to the drive levels, the low end, the mids and the highs. And again, we can look at the width of the guitars, but importantly, how it affects the vocals. And similarly, you might want to consider how it's impacting the way that the other components like the kick and the snare and the bass punch through. So we'll do this in reverse chronological order. We'll start with Buster and go through to the research team mix. This is Buster going to David Tiro. Hear how bright and aggressive those guitars are. And that's very much informed by Buster's approach with not only analog emulations, analog signal chains and paths, but also his use of harmonic distortion, not only with the guitars. He uses the distressor, which obviously is going to add a little bit of coloration to the guitars, but the fact that he uses 2 instances of Saturn on his mix, one broadband with tape emulation, and then another one that has a greater amount of drive in the top end. So it's not just Buster's approach with the actual gestures that he applies to the guitars, but also his master bus signal chain. So again, let's go from Buster to David Tiro and keep going. David Tiro, Nolly, Josh, Mike Exeter, Jens Bogren, Frederick, and lastly Andrew Sheps, then the research team mate. It's really interesting. So here you'll hear with Jens's mix, what Jens has done is he's actually clearing space for the vocal by slightly ducking the guitars, not in a way that you'd notice, or hopefully not notice, I don't believe you do, slightly ducking the guitars when the vocals are in. When the vocals aren't in, they just slightly rise up in level, and he's really cleared out space for the vocal. You can clearly hear that in his vocal presentation. Just listen one more time. Whereas compared to my own mix, the research team mix, a very different vocal sound that's impacted by the way that the guitars are presented within the mix. And what you'll hear here as well, you've actually got the symphonic components coming in here, and each producer will have had their own ideas about how they contribute or detracted to the mix, but there's some quite big tones here. There's brass sections, which myself and Jan listened to these brass and we were like, wow, brass can sound really heavy, these big tubas in the low end. But obviously you've then got to get them into the mix, and you've got to find a space or carve a space for them within the mix. And you've got strings, you've got woodwind sections, and it's interesting to hear how different producers have dealt with that. So again, from the research team mix, we'll then go to Andrew Sheps and we'll go chronological through here. Andrew Sheps, Frederick Nordstrom, you can hear that Frederick really didn't lean heavily on these orchestral elements. Listen to Jens Bogren's. Whereas Jens really gone for those strings cutting through with those sort of like staccato and pizzicato kind of lines here. Mike Exeter. Not as bright a sound to the strings, but they're still cutting through. Josh Middleton. Josh really hasn't chosen to use them. You know, I'm sure Josh has just gone, no, I don't want it messing with the riff. I don't want it to mess with the guitars. Whereas Adam, similar but not to as great an extent. David Tiro, a little bit in there. And Buster, a little bit. It's interesting. So the different producers from Jens Bogren. Really to chose those on. Same with my own mix. But not as much as Jens. And again, it changes the heaviness quotient, if you will, within this section. And then later on, we've got the vocals coming in. And there's vocal harmonies here, and the different producers have chosen different approaches with these vocal stacks. So here, Andrew Sheps, Frederick Nordstrom, Jens Bogren, Mike Exeter, Josh Middleton, Adam Nolly Getgood, you can hear that very low harmony that Nolly's gone for there. Dave Attiro, got reasonable amount of the BV harmonies there, and Buster O'Dowd. Buster has also gone with the lower harmony quite significantly there. So that gives us a real overview of the different components. I urge you, anybody watching this, to go through this on your own. This is only a small fraction of the different aspects. You know, for example, listening to the vocal harmonies, you could listen to the amount of reverb on those components that contributes to it all. If this video was going to be covering absolutely every component of the mix, it would be several hours long, and I'll spare you that. Last thing to consider though is the sort of funnel, if you will, where all of the multi-track go to, all of those components go to, which is the master bus, and the different impacts that those master bus approaches have. So busters, as I've already mentioned, on the instrument bus, not the vocals and not the orchestration or the synths in the track. It's got 2 layers of the Saturn plugin by FabFilter, adding saturation to the mix, and that clearly impacts all of those qualities. So you will very, very clearly hear this sense of aggression and distortion and brightness in Buster's mix, compared to Mike Exeter, who really didn't lean heavily. He wanted a more organic approach to when he did his mix, the way it was kind of compressed and processed on the master bus. And you'll hear, you know, with different producers in different ways. And it's important to say that it's not just the individual mix gestures, it's the gestures that they apply to the overall mix. And again, it's just important to say that it's not just individual processing or drum group component, it's the funnel that all of these eventually goes through on the master bus that has impacted these mixes differently and in different ways. I'm sure you'll agree, there's huge differences between these mixes, and I urge you to listen to those differences, analyze those differences, and then go one step further. And if you can, start mapping those differences to the approaches, the mix approaches used by each of these different mix engineers. And then you'll be able to map the outcomes to what the processing approaches of these original producers were. It's absolutely fascinating. I've done it myself and it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for watching.